Hello, Matthias.
Hello, Andrea.
How are you?
Sorry, did you say something?
How are you?
Oh, thanks. Oh, fine, thanks. I'm back from vacation now, so that's why I missed last week's meeting.
Yeah. It was nice.
Yeah. So when we're waiting, have you gotten any idea about, I'm switching subject now, idea about the images? For example, in Tecton, you had a bunch of images in the CDF repo, the originals for those images.
Right, I asked, but I didn't get any reply on that. So I don't think usually we get those, but I'm not sure if there is any reason we couldn't.
Okay, I was just wondering how you host those originals.
I mean, there's the files are provided by a design team, which I don't interact to directly, but we interact with them through the CDF. And there is a brief and like creative brief that it was sent out, and usually on the brief there is a kind of the output format that we want to get, and that's usually SVG and PNG, and then those are stored in Git.
Okay, so the community hasn't created them, but that was created by CDF then. Those images then.
Yeah, so I'm to be honest, I'm not sure. There is some design team. I'm not sure if it's part of the Linux Foundation or it's a third party that the CDF works with.
I believe they are contractors, but I'm not 100% sure. Last time we worked with the CDF, they were contractors by the Linux Foundation. Ultimately, it doesn't matter for us.
Okay, huh? Evan, I was just wondering, background is that we're, for AFOL, we're having an internal discussion for how to handle images and how to handle originals. So that's why I was digging around to see how other communities are doing it and see if we pick up a good idea. But okay, yeah.
Yeah, hi Oleg and hi Emil.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Not anymore. Oh, you're back.
Looks like something is not going right?
We can hear you.
Do you hear me? Because
yeah, I can hear you at least.
Yeah, because it looks like there are some problems, but I'm not sure on whose side. It's like we lost Andrea.
Are you still there, Andrea?
Yeah, I'm still there.
Yeah, good.
Trying to learn how to spell everyone's surname correctly.
Just want to just copy and paste from the previous, but they go faster.
You could do like we do in SIG Interoperability, that everyone signs in the documents instead, if you want to.
Yeah, makes sense. All right. I know Steve will not join today. And Eric is here. Great. Shall I share the? I can do. Oh, let's start the share, and then we can. All right. So hello everyone, and thanks for joining today. And I think for the agenda today, we basically have the review of the actions and discussions. The only thing I wanted to mention first is that I created an account on Twitter, which is _CD events, which for now it's a placeholder, but at least we hold that, and we can set it up once we get the logo and everything. The one without the underscore was already taken, as well as event CD. Okay.
So when it comes to the first one there, generic versus concrete activity events, I know we already discussed it on the 5th of October, and I seem to recall us reaching a conclusion that, yes, we want to have both concrete and generic activity events, but I couldn't find that written down anywhere, so I didn't dare close the discussion really. Did we decide that we wanted to have both concrete and generic ones?
I think we did. At least that would be my. I'm trying to remember if we decided or not. I'm definitely supporting that option. I don't remember any opposing. Yeah.
I think my main objection was that, as I wrote there, that we will never have a conclusive list of specific activities. So of course we at least need a generic activity as well then, I guess. But I guess it's fine to define specific activities. I'm not sure if those should be handled like sub activity types or something, or if it should be, if they should all be top level types. Is there, I mean, we haven't really discussed, as far as I know at least, any other hierarchy of event types in the protocol. But this is one place where we could talk about hierarchies, where some generic activity, or I don't know, meta activity is the top level, and then we can have different types underneath it somehow. Because for sure all activities will have some parameters in common, I guess. Or
it makes sense to me. I mean, from a design perspective, I think it would be really nice if we had generic activity events, and as you said, sort of subclass those for specific ones. I do see a benefit of having specific ones on top of the generic ones, and that would be to promote alignment and promote interoperability. Because maybe if all we deliver are generic activities, then we provide somehow too much flexibility, so that it will actually not be that easy to use our spec to make things work together, because it's too generic, or it only allows for generic things.
Yeah, and as you know, Eric, and maybe others as well, in Eiffel we have this generic activity only, and what we have there is that we have an enum that says what type of activity it is, which is more or less what we talk about now, the different types of activities, or specific. But we haven't really identified the need so far for further parameters that are, so to say, activity type specific. So that's why we can still stay with that in Eiffel, I guess. But if we see that, well, a build activity should always have this additional parameter just because it is a build activity, then that makes sense to have it as a specific event type as well. But I think it would be good to see that all of these specific activities are somehow children of a generic activity.
But I think in AFL you have parameters with the links concept. I think you can provide a lot of the metadata or reference a lot of the information that would perhaps go into, for instance, say that you have a build activity. One parameter that you might really want to have is what source did I build? And in AFL that would be solved by a link, I think. And the same is if you run a test activity, what test did I run? That would also be solved by a link in AFL, I think. So if we don't have those kind of links, then having subclasses for event types would be another way of solving it in some sense.
Yeah, and I think we might probably have links as well, at least optionally in this protocol as well, but it shouldn't be mandatory. And then this is another way of, as I say, dealing with the same thing. I'm not sure if it's very bad to have multiple ways to do the same thing, but I think maybe depending on use case, it could be valid to use different ways of expressing things still, to some extent, not too much, of course. But I totally agree that if we don't have any specific activities at all and don't have these types in the generic event either, we will not standardize on the level that we intend to. So I think it makes some kind of sense, at least, to have sub-activity types.
Yeah, I definitely think we should have specific activities, because I think that's where we create the value of kind of having a common semantic for these activities across different platforms. And we could, as we discussed, I think earlier, go a step farther and have kind of a reference document to try and map these activities to the terminology of the specific platforms.
Yeah, I think one reason for having a generic top level activity, would be that we need somehow to trace how our activities connected to each other, regardless of if they are build or test or delivery activities or whatever the kind of activity they are. I mean, they all make up a pipeline somehow, and they should all be able to provide traceable information for the duration of the different steps in a pipeline, regardless of what type of activity it is, and how they are connected, if they are parallel or serial or whatever. So those kinds of properties, or as we would do it with the links in Eiffel, I think we still need as a generic property on all these kinds of activities.
Yeah, so basically we would say, we would have a section in our spec where we say these are like general properties that needs to be available regardless of what specific activity that we're talking about. And then specific activities could extend that with additional parameters. Right? Is that what you're saying, basically?
Yeah, that's it is.
Does it mean that we would also consider it possible for a system to like emit a generic activity without being a specialized one? Or I'm not sure that would,
I think it would be nice with having a generic event, because there is, I mean, you can have two scenarios. For example, in this case, it's like, for example, FOSS scanning, where you have some other step that is not a common one. And then you could, if you only have like build, test, deliver, and deploy those fixed events, then you would be kind of like, okay, this is a security step or some kind of other thing, and you map it into build, and that is not 100% correct. So by having a generic event, you can map those activities to a generic event instead. And in my head, that feels more true to map it to a generic event rather than mapping it to build event when it isn't a really build event.
Yeah,
And
but
my
you
other
still want
thoughts.
to be able to trace it and connect it just as any other activity event, for example. So you can use those features in the event to connect different activities to each other and whatever other generic activity parameter we should have.
My only concern with that is that if we start if we allow for generic activity to be sent, that platform will use generic activity in most cases because they will feel maybe the others are not the perfect fit, and then we will end up with having every platform. We might end up having every platform sending events which other platforms do not understand because they're just generic activities and the semantic of that event is not understood, which is, I guess, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, there is already some value because at least you get like something was started and finished or queued and successful or unsuccessful. So you get that part of the information. But yeah, you kind of risk to lose on these common semantics.
And I think that's on the producer. I mean, a requirement to the producers of these events that if you want a consumer to understand that this is a build, if it is actually a build, then you need to set it as a build activity. And you can't just set it on a generic activity because people won't, or other consumers won't understand or won't interpret this as a build activity. So of course the producer should be as specific as possible. And if there is a dedicated activity type for it, then there should be, not enforced, but they should be suggested to use it if they see that there are consumers that could be interested in that kind of information. If for some simple event sending use case, you would only like to see whatever activities are in this pipeline and how are they connected and if they are successful or not. It doesn't matter if they are build activities or test activities. There could be such consumers that just care about the actual activities generically, and then it could be okay for those producers to just send those events. It could be a simpler adoption of the protocol for those use cases. So I think, I mean, we will have that. I mean, that argument can, I guess, be said more or less always for optional parameters as well. If you don't provide these optional parameters, the consumers won't be able to understand what that parameter would have shown if you don't add it. So unless we specify all properties and event types specifically, there will be cases where events received are less complete than other events with the same type. So as a consumer, you would always be able, you need to cover for those different kinds of, I mean, different detailed leveled events. And as a consumer, you should put, of course, requirements on those producers to provide more details whenever needed. Does that make sense?
Because like,
yeah, I think so. So I tried to capture this. Say we define then generic activities. So generic activity defines common parameters required by all activities. We also define specific activities, and implementer should use the specific activities if available. Does this capture at least the high level discussion? And is this something that we can then agree on, and then we could close this discussion list and capture these.
It makes sense to me. I think there are maybe two ways to implement this so that we might not be able to solve today. If it should be really a hierarchical event type setup here, or if we should just have the generic activity is just another activity, another event of the same level somehow. I'm not sure if that's really, if we want to introduce hierarchy of event types today.
What is the concrete implication of a hierarchy at this level?
I guess that then there would be an event schema for the generic event, and then all the event schemas for this specific events need to somehow include that generic event schema in themselves or refer to them. So then they need to be correct specific activity events. They need to adhere to that top level schema then. But of course there are drawbacks with that when it comes to updating the schema and whatever, but maybe it's easier to enforce that you actually are aligned with the generic activity type if it is hierarchical, and not just saying that each specific activity type should have these and these properties in them.
So basically, it's like the object-oriented program that you have a base class that would be the basic activity event, and then you have build, test, deliver, deployed, and other ones would be kind of subclasses for it. So I agree.
guess
That
that's an
could actually,
implementation. Yeah. Go on.
so that could be a, as you what you're describing could be a motivation for having a hierarchical things to keep track of if we create other events, because I guess we want to have a pretty rich vocabulary of events, because just build, test, deliver, deploy, I mean, there are going to come other events in the future. I mean, there's a lot of problem security scanning and so on they want to get an event for. And when you expand all these events, having this control mechanism or hierarchy would probably help us making sure that there's some alignment between all of these activity events.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think at the level of this discussion, I think saying that a generic activity define common parameters that are required by all activities kind of imply this hierarchy. And I think that's, yeah, that was my question. Is it something we can agree on? And I think whether then how this maps into JSON schemas or validation of events, it's something that may be specific to the JSON payload binding, and maybe discussion we can reserve to do when we design that part.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good.
Just to capture, Andrea, did you think this was okay with having a hierarchy, or did you think it was better with having kind of like a flat structure?
No, I think it's okay to say that we have a place where we define like common features of the protocol that should be met by all activities, regardless of the kind of the type. So I think that's okay. I'm not sure if a generic activity might have specific parameters that are not required by all other activities or not. I don't know if that would break the concept of hierarchy. If that is the case, we could have kind of abstract activity and then a generic activity that inherits from it and all the other as well. But in general, I think, yeah, having a hierarchy makes sense. The only problem I have with hierarchy is how to spell it correctly, but looks like this
Yeah,
time I
that's-
made it.
It's a continuous issue for me as well. I always get a red squiggly line when I try.
So I'll mark this as a decision, and then we need to capture this in the spec, but at least it's documented here in the discussion. Maybe I should. So it's clear that it's not me just saying. Is this reasonable format?
Yeah, I think it looks good.
Okay. So
I have updated this page to mark that as resolved. The next one is a bit tricky. I think there is already a lot of input, and I put an action on myself to go through the discussion and try to figure out what the heck is going on. But I don't think it would be too productive to look into that now. I think I need to look at the discussion first and yeah, come back to it.
okay. So shall we all look into it? Maybe.
There's like a lot of input here, so I'm not sure if we could do it live, but yeah, that could be homework to next time if you want to have it like that.
Okay. We can mark it here. Okay. Okay, so what about next one?
Yeah, that would be interesting to discuss, at least in my opinion.
What is an artifact? Yeah. Okay, do you want to lead some discussion on this? Eric, maybe you have some fresh context on this
I
one?
can try. So for many types of continuous delivery flows, an artifact will mainly be the result of some build, which is the main, like a Docker image or a built binary or something like that. But for the types of continuous delivery flows that I typically am typically involved in, then there are many other things that are produced by continuous delivery pipelines. It can be like documentation, it can be not necessarily hardware that would be produced by it, but a hardware definition could be something like it. And also what we could call or what AFL calls a composition, where you have selected a bunch of different built binaries and something and combine it together and say, this is now the thing that I want to do something on. And in one of the earlier PRs, I introduced the concept of a, I don't remember if I call it composition, I call it baseline sometimes as well. But my sort of question is, do we see all these things as artifact? Is like everything that is produced by a continuous delivery pipeline is an artifact, or do we have different types of things that are produced and we call files artifact? That's like another way of looking at it. I think that was my main point here.
Okay, so just what comes to mind to me, I think, listening to your presentation of this, Eric, is that we could have similar to the events, if you would, like a generic artifact. So we could say artifact is something that is produced by an activity that happened. And if we wanted to, then we could leave some space for specialization of this artifact. And we could discuss whether we want to have that captured at the protocol level or not. Or we could leave it like free form for platform to, if they want to provide extra metadata and they want to say this artifact of type container image, or it's artifact of type it's bomb, or it's artifact of type yeah, I don't know, hardware description, deployment description, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I guess again, if we do provide certain types, that's always that might go in the direction of making it possible for different platforms to understand them each other better. Because if you know that a container image was produced, you may be able to know what to do. Instead, if you only know that some artifact was produced, you might not know what to do with that. So
yeah, I think that's I think that would work out quite nicely. And I should be the first to admit that my world is embedded software in complex products. That's all I work with. That's all I've ever worked with. So I will definitely have a biased view on a lot of this stuff. But I think, like, for instance, if we say that we have a generic artifact or like a base artifact something, and then can have specialized subtypes, where one of those subtypes, for instance, could be something like a composition, where we say this artifact doesn't really have its own files, for instance, it's mostly pointing out other artifacts that together are meaningful in some sense, then that would probably be good enough for the use cases that I see. So yeah, and then we could have have one artifact type, as you said, that is like a container image, and that could have references to specific files and stuff. And we could have another artifact that is more like a composition or super group of artifacts or whatever you want to call it. That would be fine, as long as we, yeah, the important thing for me, I guess, is that we don't write a specification that assumes that every single artifact corresponds to a single file, and we limit the protocol to that. But yeah, and so your solution would work fine, I think.
I also agree, and I think it's an interesting thought to actually have hierarchical event types here as well. I haven't really thought of that before, but maybe that actually works. But maybe we need to somehow describe what is then specific to a artifact on the top level. What parameters? Maybe not need to specify all of them now, but what parameters are? I mean, identifies an artifact somehow, and distinguishes this from something else that is not an artifact. Does it, for example, need to have a specific version of it? Can an artifact be recreated, or is it something that is always the same thing, whether you rebuild it or not, or whatever? Can you rebuild it and have the same artifact again, or is it unique somehow, immutable?
I think you are asking very important questions. I think for me, if I were to just throw something out there, then probably an artifact has a unique identifier, and it has a version, and probably it has some sort of reference as to how it was produced, or like who created it or how it was created.
Yeah,
Those
and I think it needs to have been created as well. I mean, it couldn't be input to the pipeline somehow. It needs to be something that is created or generated or built or whatever, produced.
Yeah,
So
I would say
it from source code, for example. It's not the same as a source code file that comes from a SCM system or something.
I agree. Yes. I would say, though, it doesn't have to be built in the pipeline. It can be built by someone else or somewhere else. Like a common thing in the vehicle industry is that you get something from a supplier, and I would define what we get from the supplier as an artifact, even though we didn't build it. Someone built it, and now we need to react to the fact that there is a new artifact. But yes, it wouldn't be source code. Typically, it would be someone has transformed something into something else, and that would be the artifact.
But I think from that station point of view, Emil was saying, okay, where does this come from? I mean, if you don't build something but you provide it as an output of a pipeline, you should at least kind of own the attestation for that, or be able to provide an attestation for that, or saying, me as a pipeline, I kind of certify that this artifact is what it is, and then I can relay it as an output of this other artifact, if it makes sense. Maybe not. Try to. I think if it.
So yeah, continue.
Go ahead.
I've linked further up in this discussion to Wikipedia, where they define artifacts in software development. And there they state it's basically an artifact is one of many kinds of tangible byproducts produced during development of softwares. So that's, maybe we could go in something direction about what that one has. But then it might be a problem of the one that Eric is talking about with just pointing out something else.
Yeah, and I think both AFL and ESCI has chosen to have a different term for that. AFL calls it a composition, ESCI calls it a baseline. But I mean, we could absolutely implement it if we could get a specialized artifact that is a composition. I mean, that wouldn't be a technical problem. It's more a matter of terminology, as you say here.
I also think that an artifact is something that could be the subject for a test or a review or a deployment or a delivery. So it should be, an artifact should always be possible to use as somehow a subject in the pipeline, which might not be the case for all other things, all other entities that we deal with in the pipeline.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be basically binding an artifact to an input, but an input artifact, if we could. But if you have if you have a workflow, and the very first input of that workflow, I don't know if you would call that an artifact. I mean, it will be an artifact of some other workflow, but it would be an input from its workflow point of view.
We would call it an artifact because it matters more what it is than exactly where it came from. That would be or in ECI we would do it that way at least. Because a common handover point between workflows is that one workflow produces an artifact that one or more other workflows want to say, oh, now there is a new version of something here and I want to start doing stuff.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Maybe I was unclear before, but of course, I also think so. An artifact can be created by some other flow that does or does not send events for it, whatever. But to be able to refer to them, there needs to be some artifact created event or whatever we call it.
Yeah.
I guess. Or some, yeah. Somehow.
Emil, question to you. Based on how you use composition defined event in AFL, do you foresee any problems for those use cases if it was rather a subclass of artifact?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I don't really think it is. I mean, in IFL we can refer to both compositions and artifacts as subjects for something that you test, for example.
Mm.
And you can set what we call a confidence level or maturity level on, I think, both compositions and artifacts as well. So to me, it makes kind of sense to see compositions as some kind of artifact as well. I mean, it's, of course, you build this baseline or whatever we call it. So it's something that is created probably within the pipeline. So in that sense, it is an artifact. As we use it, mostly in Ericsson at least, is that we don't always have identities on these compositions. So I mean, we created a baseline, and the identity of it is maybe where it is stored in the Git commit or whatever. So the Git commit more or less identifies the baseline together with a lot of other things maybe. So there is no specific identity always on a composition in Ericsson, and therefore it's not it's not required in the Eiffel protocol either for historical reasons then. So maybe we could have a slight problem there if we should require that any artifact has a unique identity and should be immutable. Because then it might be so that you don't always version your baselines that way, maybe. Or maybe you should, and I don't know. I'm trying to think out loud now.
Yeah.
But if you're using these compositions to build from, I hope they are immutable and well defined.
Yes, I mean the events that contain them is of course immutable. So in the Eiffel world, then a composition actually contains all. It has a list of all these included things. So the event itself is of course immutable, but it doesn't point to anything that exists somewhere else that is immutable as a baseline file or whatever. So maybe that's the difference, that a composition in Eiffel terms, actually that composition event contains the actual composition, but an artifact event doesn't contain the artifact. It instead refers to a previously created artifact. So yeah, that's a difference that I'm not really exactly sure right now how we can overcome, if we should see compositions as artifacts.
Do we have need for, because what we're talking about here is basically we define some kind of a grouping or a file, but we don't want to put it on the file system. Is there other places within our protocol that we need to have create like lists or something that we don't have a file for?
I'm not sure if this relates exactly to what you said, Matthias, but in ESCI, we would have a database that holds information about all these compositions. And what we would like to do is to send out an event to saying, here is someone has defined a new composition, or we have a new version of this composition recipe, and just announce it. And then anyone who is interested in taking action based on this composition could do that based on the message. But it would have a separate storage. It would have like a URL that you could visit to figure out or to find everything that you're interested in this composition. So I think what Eiffel allows is these like sort of on the fly compositions can be quite powerful. But in ESCI, we don't have a use case for it, as I see it right now, at least.
Yeah, just as we should, if we want to have on the fly compositions or something, we should point that out, because that might be a divergence from the rest of the information that I have, that we're pointing to other factors, but here we have the information inside the message itself.
Yeah.
But Emil, do you foresee a problem other than maybe have storage and so on, for instead of having on the fly compositions, that you actually define the composition as a file. And we call that an artifact.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. Of course, if we would require that, it would affect our flows a lot. I guess if there isn't a way to deal with identities in another way than we do today, for example, and well, if we always require that compositions or baselines need to be a file that is possible to point out from some repository, artifact repository, that could be an added burden that we don't want to have, maybe. But let's try this thought and see how it stands. Of course, we can revisit this decision again if we see the need for it. But
Because another way would be that we defined artifacts to always point to something else. So in the artifact, we don't define something, but then we can, in the protocol, define as like, I'm talking more like virtual or something temporary, like a list or something. If we have a message that can define some kind of grouping, and then the artifact can point to this grouping instead of writing to the file.
yeah, that's one option. Yeah. But let's try this. I think it could work.
So they would just say that artifact is then something that points to basically we don't have an on the fly composition. We're not talking about that right now then.
Great.
So just trying to summarize, I think so do we agree at least on this having like this generic artifact and specialized artifact structure?
One thing that Emil mentioned in the beginning, which I agree with, is we shouldn't refer to source code as artifacts. I'm not sure exactly how to capture that in a good way, but I agree with it.
Yeah, it is maybe a bit hard to describe. I mean, we shouldn't have a C file in a Git repository being an artifact. That is because that's something that's created by a developer. But of course, there could be artifacts included in a source change. I mean, think libraries that are built or whatever that are somehow stored in a repository in Git, and then that source change contains artifacts.
Yeah, definitely. Configuration files would be a candidate for me for artifacts that you might have, like you have a code repository and you have a bunch of C files, for instance, and then you also have an XML file that defines a configuration, and we might want to publish the XML file as an artifact saying, here is something that could go into other compositions. But the C files, since they need to be sort of built to become an artifact, they wouldn't be artifacts in themselves. But this is going to be tricky to define in a clear way.
I think it's a blurred line there, because then you could consider XML or YAML file as source code as well. Like if you're developing a Tecton task, then it's in YAML. It's a configuration file, but it can be sophisticated, become sophisticated enough that you could actually consider it as a source code because it's written by someone. But on the other side, you could have like a templated files. You could have templated C files or YAML file or XML, and they're generated then by injecting with some properties, and then is the result an artifact or not?
Maybe it would be sufficient to start with to say there is no expectation that CD event producers send out artifact updated or artifact created events for every single source code change, because we have other events for that. It's more like it's somehow up to the producer to think about what individual files may someone want to take action on and make sure that those get published as artifacts. I can't even describe it in a good way, but yeah.
Or if I make a PR and I have some patch files associated to that PR, are those artifacts?
Sorry, what type of files did you say in your PR?
I don't know if I have some, if I generate some patch files that can be then applied to reproduce my PR. Are those an artifact?
Yeah, I'm not sure if my view is consistent, but yes, I would be willing to consider those artifacts.
Okay. Right.
But then it's maybe important for us to define, okay, what's different in an artifact and a source code file. So because people are going to wonder, okay, when is an artifact, and when it's not a source code.
Maybe it's sufficient then to say, is this the file that I'm thinking about? Is that something that where I want to make that individual file announced to the rest of the system? And if that is yes, then you should send that out as an artifact. And if the answer is no, then it might be fine to just consider it part of a source code repository or something else, because no one will be interested in that individual file.
I guess that definition would catch much of the problems that could arise otherwise.
But it would sort of put the responsibility on whoever sends those messages. But maybe that is fine, because maybe they are the ones that knows. Yeah, as Andrea said, this is a blurred line, so maybe we can't give a super clear answer. But definitely, I would stand by that every individual file that someone wants to be able to take action on should be an artifact. That makes sense to me.
Because as I said, I mean, a YAML file or XML file might be checked in, or in one case it might be checked in and be part of the source code, and another way it might be something that signals like a build recipe or something that's going to be used by build process. So yeah,
I agree. Something that you would like the surrounding world to see as an artifact, you should notify as an artifact. I mean, it's up to the producer somehow to say what are the artifacts that I create or deal with in this pipeline, with this build step or whatever. So sorry guys, I need actually to leave right now. I have another appointment. So thanks for a good discussion today. I'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Emil. See you next time. So I will add this comment to the discussion. I think we might have specific items defined, like what are the properties of an artifact. That's something that we could discuss more specifically. And also there is a discussion on composition that we did not reach an agreement on. And we still have the open question of defining exactly what is an artifact. But I think maybe we can agree on having a generic artifact, specialized artifact, and on the being a generic input or output of a workflow.
Yeah, I think I'm becoming more and more in favor of having these hierarchies, because trying to figure out one event that solves everyone's problem is going to be tricky. But instead having a generic base that So as Emil said, people who are not interested in exactly what type of artifact this is, but just want to be aware that there's a new artifact, they can just deal with the generic stuff. And for systems that are interested in only container images or only log files, they can listen for specialized artifact events. So I think, yeah, it seems like if we do it well, it seems like it could be a good balance between flexibility and alignment, which I like.
But should we pin down what we said there with an artifact is something when you want to announce a file or something for the outside world, you send an artifact event for it. So that is basically an artifact is something that you want to announce exists.
I could add that as a comment to it, or we could try to get it into Andreas' comment here. I don't have to. So basically, maybe the statement would be, when it comes to files in source code repositories, then it would be up to the producer to state, is this individual file something I want to make the rest of the world aware of? If it is, then I should send it as an artifact. And if it is not, then it doesn't need to be sent that way.
Okay. I thought in my understanding until now, it was artifact was like one of the properties of other events. Like if I have a build event or generic activity event, that might have an artifact as an output. Are you saying now that we have artifact specific events like artifact created, artifact created event?
Yeah, we have those events right now.
We do have them.
We have it something that created
Yes,
or published.
yes. Right. Okay. Yeah, I was mixing things up. All right. Okay. Yeah, I see. So.
But the question is, should we move out this with composition then to its own discussion so we don't mix it with an artifact? Would you say, Eric?
Sorry, I didn't follow the train of thought there. What was your...
When it comes to compositions, should that be part of the artifact discussion, or should we move it to another question that is, how do we define a composition?
For my use case, it would be fine to say that a composition is a specialization of an artifact, because the things that we say hold true for an artifact, meaning that it has an ID and name, possibly version and some other things. For me, that is true for compositions as well. It becomes an issue for AFL compositions, which are defined in the event themselves or itself.
Okay.
Right, and so like an example would be if I have a container image, I mean, I could store like an index or a manifest in a container registry, which is actually a JSON file that points to actual container images. So that would be a composition, right?
Yeah.
But it's not something that the protocol itself is aware of. So from the protocol point of view, this artifact will have a SHA, an ID, a URL, whatever we decide that needs to be provided. But the protocol itself won't be aware of the fact that this actually resolves into other artifacts, because that's someone else's concern actually to resolve that.
Yeah, that would be how I look at it. Yes.
Okay. So that would be. we say this is our starting assumption, and then, I mean, we can always revisit this.
I must say, I really like the type of discussions that we have today. I feel like it's great to revisit topics that we haven't really closed before, especially now, because I think we have all done some thinking, even if it's subconscious thinking, so that we actually get stuff closed in some sense, so we can work on the protocol for those like decided parts. I really enjoy it.
Yeah, I agree.
Same here. Cool. Okay, we are actually at time. But yeah, so let's continue then next time. And yeah.
Yeah, good meeting.
Good meeting. Yeah.
It's still catching up, but definitely a lot to study.
Yeah. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.